One of the grandest examples of the power of 4x strategy, not to mention one of the most viral, came from a redditor named Lycerius, posting in 2012 about his game of Sid Meier's Civilization II, a then 16-year-old sequel. He'd gone beyond the game's usual end date of 2020, and in doing so had unintentionally created a pure hellscape, a 1700 in-game year endless war that he had been playing for 10 very real years of his life. His communist Celts were locked in an eternal conflict against theocratic Vikings and Americans. Nukes had scarred up the land, peace treaties were bashed out and then immediately broken on the next turn, and global warming had melted the ice caps, leaving nothing but useless tundra. By this stage, the three nations were fighting just to do it, almost. It's not like there were that many resources left, or indeed that many people. Any engineer unit who could potentially start converting tundra to farmland and rebuilding the world would probably find themselves staring down a nuclear missile on the very next turn. Lycerius had somehow managed to create the purest gaming adaptation of George Orwell's 1984. He was hopeful for some kind of solution so that one civilization, ideally his, could be alone in the world and start to rebuild it, and his write-up and inquiries for a solution made it to the front pages of just about every gaming and tech site on the internet. In the end, a combination of spies planting nukes in enemy cities to obliterate long-standing armies inside the walls, and pure-grain fundamentalism to suffocate any Senate's possible quibbles, provided a solution to nearly 2 millennia worth of conflict. To this very day, a dedicated few still talk about, write fanfiction for, and tributes to the so-called Eternal War. Civilization II is one of the greatest sequels, if not one of the greatest games ever made. As it goes, the game's impact on the series it comes from is quite possibly even greater than that of the original title that it spawned from. The original Civ was a revolution all of its own, but Civ II was bold enough to make the important fundamental changes that needed to be made, and every Civ since has largely been built from its foundations. As soon as it was released, it was clear that the series was going to be here forever. But even if you might expect that such a game would be a layup, especially considering how successful the first Civilization was, well, naturally that's not the case. Indeed, much like the original, it's a wonder that Civ II happened at all. There's a lot to talk about, many new things to break down, from a creator's lack of preciousness about their work, new perspectives brought in due to the boom of the internet, all the way to a parent company in utter crisis that still struggled to truly recognise what they had when they looked at this seemingly not graphically impressive game where a single unit moving from square to square was, in fact, a grand army marching forward and writing another sentence in the chronicles of your empire. The success of the original Civilization turned the quiet yet strong-willed Sid Meier into a household name, in the gaming world at least. His name was right there on the marquee after all. You knew exactly who you could thank for those countless hours and sleepless nights spent in pursuit of that global empire. For all the struggles that the game went through, the wrangling with MicroProse's head office and the company's high-flying boss, Wild Bill Steely, to the potential legal struggles with an angered Avalon Hill, Civilization had prevailed. A game that wasn't expected to do all that much on the shelves became one of the biggest hits of the 1990s. More than just Civ itself though, the game was the culmination of an intensely prolific period for the designer that had also resulted in games like F-15 Strike Eagle, Pirates, F-19 Stealth Fighter, and Railroad Tycoon. He hadn't stopped for a decade, and the first order of business after releasing Civ was for Meier to take a well-earned break. All in all, Sid Meier was quite satisfied with his work on Civilization, and as such, well, he didn't have a huge amount of interest in making a sequel. In fact, despite the fact that every Civilization title would bear his name, Sid Meier himself would not return to his own series as the lead designer until 2008, when he headed up the console-geared Civilization Revolution. Generally speaking, he wasn't one for sequels, and had no interest in trying to create something that was even bigger. Between Civ 1 and 2, there was a little project he worked on for the 3DO called CPU Buck, a music-making program that was very much a labour of love, while his classic Pirates was remade for newer computers and brought out again as Pirates Gold, but he didn't have too much to do with that. The main game that he's recognised for between the Civs, one that's very important when it comes to the development of Civ II and is, indeed, another famous game in its own right, is of course the game with a very similar title to that of Civilization, Sid Meier's Colonization. Indeed, rather than Civ II, Colonization would be the start of Sid Meier's name appearing on a game that he actually hadn't served as lead designer on, although he took a far more considerable role in the development of the title than he did for future Civilization titles. Rather, the original idea for the game came from a Berkeley graduate named Brian Reynolds, who'd started working for MicroProse at the start of the 90s. He joined a company that was chaotic and on an inexorable decline. For all its success, Sid Meier's Civilization could only do so much to stop that, and the same applied to other strategy games, largely developed on the outside, that the studio threw themselves into. As lauded as they were, games like XCOM and Master of Magic couldn't reverse the company's fortunes. Between the diminishing commercial returns for their main line of military vehicle simulation games, and utter disasters such as their attempt to get into the arcade business, MicroProse were facing the wall, and in 1993 they were bought out by Spectrum Holobyte. Holobyte made sweeping cuts and killed various ill-advised ventures the company had tried to establish. One of these was their adventure games team, set up in a haphazard and unsuccessful attempt to compete with LucasArts and Sierra. This was the team that Brian Reynolds belonged to, where he'd programmed on games such as Rex Nebula and the Cosmic Genderbender and Return of the Phantom. The adventure game division of MicroProse was dead, but Reynolds had not yet received his cards. He figured that while he was waiting for the inevitable axe to fall, he may as well work on something. A strategy game that used Civilization as its building blocks, but with a smaller focus. Instead of creating an empire all of your own from scratch, you're thrust into an already established nation expanding into a new area, in competition with others, working to build a colonial empire. This project would ultimately become Colonization, of course, and soon enough, once people at MicroProse got wind of what Reynolds was doing, he was put together with Sid Meier. Meier had no interest in taking the project out of Reynolds' hands. He was after all knee-deep in buck at the time, and he recognised that despite being similar to Civ, and indeed being based off his game's reverse-engineered code, Reynolds' game was very much his own. And so Sid would officially be a design advisor on the game. He did well in this regard, making plenty of important notes and perhaps, you might say, acting as something of a mentor to Reynolds. After all, Reynolds was an enthusiastic player of strategy games and tabletop war games, and certainly a great lover of the original Civ, but this was the first time he'd created a strategy game of his own. The decision to put Sid Meier's name on the game as if he'd been the driving force behind it came from the marketing department. In this way, Meier himself, perversely for a man of such a soft-spoken nature, was becoming something of a brand, even if this meant that anyone who didn't read the small print would believe that he had created the game, and not Brian Reynolds. Colonization sold very well, somewhere in the region of a couple of 100,000, enough to make it an enduring title from the period, even if it's not quite as magnificent as the game it spawned from. The game comes with a bit more detail than the original Civ. There's now a lot more micromanagement involved when it comes to settlements, trade routes and the like, rather than them essentially just existing. The trouble with this is that, being as it's shoehorned into an engine and based on a game that deals very much in abstracts and speed, this addition of details and micromanagement can become rather awkward and clunky, especially as the game advances and you have more and more settlements and just general things to deal with. Some also took issue with the game being less open, with only one single aim: to have enough settlements and production in the New World to be able to declare independence by 1800, at which point you have to win a war against your parent nation by 1850. Some thought this single path to victory not just limiting but myopic. It's the American origin story after all, and it basically casts every playable nation, the British, Spanish, French and Dutch, into the role of the British, with not an awful lot of difference between them. Other issues with Colonization are, of course, of a more problematic nature, and it should be said from the outset that these were things very openly discussed at the time. People did take issue with several core parts of the game, or indeed other things that were just flat out excluded. The treatment of Native Americans was criticised. While Colonization is somewhat marketed as a quite open-ended game, the only way to really win it pretty much forces you to subjugate and bring the natives to heel, no matter how well you treat them in the beginning. You kind of need their land and resources, and there's no viable alternative. Some thought all this quite distasteful and didn't really want to interact with this part of the game at all. One could, by way of rebuttal, say that this is a historical simulation of sorts, more so than Civilization. However, this is diminished by the game's complete exclusion of slavery. In Colonization's world, human bondage just doesn't exist, really. At the very best, it's euphemized, represented in those who wanted to be shipped off to the New World, or in the form of criminals. People argued that Colonization couldn't really be called a historical simulation if it whitewashed out something so integral to the colonial period, high school textbook style. Now, at no point were the designers of the game accused of racism or prejudice, but perhaps more a certain blinkeredness. Even if the arguments weren't as common and wide-ranged as they are today, disquiet about Colonization, or indeed other similar games that took somewhat awkward, gamified views towards history like Conquest of the New World and Panzer General, were most certainly there, hotly debated in editorials and letters pages. It's worth bringing these things up because, well, this is Brian Reynolds' first strategy game. It has a lot of potential, and also a lot to work on. In the very near future, he will create strategic works of art, games that will not just be utterly engrossing from a gameplay and a fun perspective, but will also weave that gameplay through bold, complex narratives that are more than capable of handling any subject, however difficult. Colonization is most certainly still a good game, one that's not afraid to take a winning formula and change an awful lot about it, creating something new out of the existing material. Bringing up the areas where it doesn't necessarily succeed is not a way to take a PC game from 1994 and cancel it, whatever that bloody word means nowadays. For his part, Sid Meier had some disagreements about the game's design, particularly in how single-minded the game was in its winning objective, but in keeping with his initial approach to Colonization, he seceded to the lead designer, something that he did not have to do. Make no mistake, Sid Meier could have pretty much said just one word to the executives at MicroProse, and he would have taken Reynolds' place. The top table certainly would have rather a proven name like Meier be at the head of the game than a complete unknown like Reynolds. He chose not to do this, and the result is, in many ways, a success. And for Brian Reynolds, it would be an integral part of his next step forward. Having been mentored by the man behind Civilization, Reynolds was now about to receive the keys to the kingdom. Sid Meier's Colonization came out to a warm reception and decent sales, reviewers generally praising the latest creation from gaming's foremost strategic mastermind, even if he'd actually only advised on it. In contrast, the program that Sid Meier had primarily been working on, CPU Buck for the 3DO, came out to a generally lukewarm reception and quickly sank to obscurity on a dying platform. Still, it was kind of a labour of love for a religious man who adored the music of Bach and played it on the organ at his local church. Up next for Sid Meier was designing a game based on Magic the Gathering, which would eventually be his final game for MicroProse. So no, he still had no desire to head up another Civilization game. If the perpetually stumbling MicroProse, still floundering under the purview of Spectrum Holobyte, was to reap the financial rewards of another Civ game, they would have to go elsewhere. So, good thing that a guy had just finished being mentored by Sid on his first strategy game, one that he'd created after reverse engineering Civilization's code. Brian Reynolds got the go-ahead to work on a new Civilization game in late 1994. There's very little involvement from Sid this time. Instead, Brian's going to be mainly working with Doug Kaufman and Jeff Briggs. Kaufman was Brian's tag team partner. He'd been with him in MicroProse's ill-fated adventure division, and they'd worked together on a game called Dragonsphere. Briggs, aside from being the composer for the original Civilization, was also a designer and programmer who worked with Sid Meier on CPU Buck and its innovative real-time music computer composition system. The game initially was known as Civilization 2000, a title that is, quite close to SimCity 2000. Indeed, Will Wright's game was seen as the proof for MicroProse that a more iterative sequel would work, and gave them the impetus to start the ball rolling on a Civilization sequel, which of course would soon be known as Civilization II. The trio of Reynolds, Kaufman and Briggs already came into the project as big Civilization fans, of course. While Reynolds and Kaufman only came into MicroProse just as development on the original was wrapping up, they'd found themselves utterly addicted to the game, and they'd also played plenty of the original Avalon Hill board game as well. They certainly had a fair few ideas of how Civ could be improved based on their many hours of play, and they happily scoured Usenet groups and the like to see what other players were saying and what they would like to see changed. In the end, they had a pretty long list of improvements, changes and fixes to work on. Although they only had a year or so to create the game in, they had more than enough ideas on the board to make Civ II a different and worthy sequel. A good chunk of the myriad of changes are set out in Civ II's lovingly crafted novella of a manual by the team, but there's a few definite big ones. The view switching from top-down to isometric being the most immediately obvious one, allowing for significantly more detailed art and maps without the UI looking too cluttered. Other than that, well, all the big changes are in the gameplay. Civ II is a game that does its damnedest to condition you to interact with all of its systems and tries to remove some of the original's stranger foibles. It's the first Civ to introduce the concept of borders between empires, an invisible line that will soon see your troops expelled from another Civ's territory unless you share an alliance with them that can only be circumvented by caravan, explorer and diplomat spy units. Gone are the days when you could happily surround rival cities with troops before declaring war on your enemy. Now you'll have to think a bit harder about mobilisation. This also guides you towards interacting a lot more with the game's diplomacy system, which had a lot of work put into it. There's a lot more options, and the diplomacy AI is a great deal more advanced. Forms of government and certain wonders can also stop a player from going too gung-ho. Democracy comes with a whole load of benefits in the technological and cultural departments, but a Senate won't just let you go to war with enemies for no reason, and the United Nations will also have a say in the late game. Certainly when it comes to the higher difficulties, there's a lot more planning out to be done, a lot more serious strategy, a lot more playing with a purpose whether you want to paint the world red with the blood of your enemies, or take the first available spaceship off of Earth and towards Alpha Centauri. Now of course you're probably going to be fighting at some point or another, that's just the way of things. And there's been a big load of changes here too, primarily in the introduction of hit points. One of the most famous foibles of the original game was that battles were based on weighted dice rolls, each unit having a chance of victory out of 100 depending on what they were and who they were fighting. A modern battleship would naturally beat an ancient phalanx 99 times out of 100, and yet, well, sometimes the one just comes up, and those 1,000-year-old men armed with naught but spears have just sunk your state-of-the-art war machine. In Civ II, this pretty much never happens. Little energy bars represent your unit's strength, and generally units take more than one hit to kill. There's also a much more significant distinction between units that are built for attack and those that are better suited to defense, and more consideration towards the terrain that you're fighting on, and how far into a turn you choose to attack. Even if you have units that are far more advanced than your enemies, it may be a foolish move to attack a heavily fortified unit at the end of your unit's turn, when they're only operating at a third of their strength. The addition of hit points also means that units aren't immediately back to full strength. The damage they take in battle does last. So after a particularly messy scrap, you may want to consider resting your soldiers up for a bit, either by letting them suck wind on the field by skipping a few turns, or ideally by taking them off to a city that's got a barracks, airport or port facility, depending on what the unit is. These changes are some of the more visible ones, but there's a whole ton more to be found. The makers of Civ II wanted to link everything up as much as possible, rather than having all facets of the game exist in their own little world, vastly improving the links between, say, different types of government and the effects that city improvements have. Diplomacy, a rather simple thing in the first Civ game, is now highly complex. Your relations with enemies go through a whole different set of grades rather than simply being at peace or at war. You can now be neutral, you can have a full alliance with a Civ which allows you to move freely through their territories, and you can also negotiate temporary ceasefires that'll put the brakes on a war for 10 turns. No longer are you basically at war with an enemy if you refuse to sign a peace treaty. Also, you now have a reputation to consider. If you're fond of setting up treaties with other civilizations and then breaking them later on, other civs are going to be very wary of doing any business with you. And you can even piss them off if you try and hold meetings with them too much. They may just not want to speak to you at all. The tech tree has been heavily modified so that there are less dead-end technologies. There's a whole lot of rebalancing when it comes to units, adding a lot of new ones that serve to bridge a gap between medieval knights and modern armour, in the words of the manual, while also slightly weakening originally overpowered units like the chariot and strengthening underpowered units like the musketeers. The same applies to wonders. There's several new ones that bring the total up to 28, a lot of the effects have changed, and the two most overpowered wonders from the first game, the pyramids and the SETI program, have been scaled back somewhat. Finally, there's a brand new difficulty level, Deity, an all-new hefty challenge for super players. But at the same time, computer AI has been greatly improved across the board and is a whole lot fairer. The computer now actually has to fully build wonders this time around, for example, rather than just getting them during one particular turn. This whole boatload of changes serves to try and make Civilization II a more complex and more balanced game than the original, while also not neglecting the things that made Civilization great. There's no desire here to bog the game down in micromanagement, something that Colonization suffered from. I think it certainly helps that this time around more than one person worked on the game. Whereas Sid Meier was essentially alone on the first game, Civ II has a whole group of primary designers and coders. As detailed in the designer's notes, it all started in a roundtable meeting with Sid, Brian and Jeff. There was a great deal of examination of all the best suggestions sent in by fans either through snail mail or on the internet. Brian Reynolds retreated temporarily to the dates of Yorkshire to hammer out the designs and prototypes, and then it all came together with Brian, Jeff and Doug Kaufman going at it. Naturally, this time with the help of a lot more people at MicroProse working on QA, multimedia, art and so on. There's other improvements to the game that are worthy of note, as well as some things the team wanted to include but ultimately couldn't. We've not even covered the best and most important of all the improvements yet, in fact. We'll get to that in the next chapter, as we see just what it's like to play Civilization II and work on building that glorious empire. Of course, when you start a game of Civ II, there's other changes that you should take note of pretty quickly. Seeing as this is a CD-ROM game, you have a nice opening intro video and CD quality music. This is but the first signifier of this game being a Civ released slap bang in the glorious era of multimedia, and it won't be the last. And of course you'll have more civilizations to choose from. The original had 14 civilizations, and the second game now has 21. Not only that, but each Civ has 2 different leaders, depending on the gender you've chosen, or the gender the computer has chosen. A monster myriad of usual options available. How big a world do you want? How many rival civs? Pick a difficulty from chieftain up to the new deity. Choose how many barbarians you'd like to have kicking around and so on. You'll find new options based around deciding your civilization's architectural style, as well as being able to load in custom maps, which is something we'll get to soon enough. For now, Civ II pretty much starts like any other Civilization game, and a lot of the changes will become apparent as you play and undoubtedly become hooked. As far as the raw appeal goes, not a lot has changed. This is still glorious, beautiful Civilization, as addictive as the first game. Everything that applies to the first game applies to this one. The new fancier graphics just help things along, the experience just as quick as you move settlers around, found a new city, build your first units, gradually uncover what's nearby and search villages in the hope for extra resources. You may get unlucky and unleash some barbarians, but you may also find anything from gold to new technology, an extra unit to an advanced tribe that can become a city. Hopefully you find a good place for your capital. There's plenty more resources to mine after all. If there's a river nearby, you can use it just as you would a road and move units up and down it quicker. Another little yet significant change that's very important in the early game and was actually first introduced in Colonization. So yeah, it's good as ever, really. Whether you've played hundreds of hours of the original Civ, or this was your first Civ game full stop, there's a lot to love about it. The additions, tweaks and improvements, a lot of which we have already discussed, only serve to make it an even better and more engrossing experience. For me personally, this was my first proper PC CD-ROM game bought at a shop in Lakeside, having previously loved the original Civ on Amiga. So there was certainly plenty of familiarity already, even if I'm not necessarily the most skilled Civ player or anything like that. Of course, things like that don't matter all too much with Civ. Every Civilization game is a long, complex story, no matter if it ends in your glorious success over everyone else or an ignoble failure. Right from the start, you've got to make the most of your advantages and recognise where you're lacking. You meet your first few fellow civilizations, take stock of them and see how they're doing, how much of a threat they're going to be and so forth. Perhaps you're sharing space with a genteel King Frederick II of the Germans, or a more immediately hostile Montezuma of the Aztecs. Worst of all, perhaps you've come across Gandhi and you've pissed yourself immediately at seeing the perpetual glint of atomic fire reflecting off its glasses. Who cares if that's just an urban legend? It all gradually becomes clear, and you'll soon need a direct, long-term plan in order to stay ahead. I think one of the strongest areas of Civ II compared with the original is how much more it feels like you're playing a game against actual players, which is a big positive for the game's artificial intelligence. You got less of that feeling in the first Civ. There wasn't much you could do in terms of interacting with them, and it really didn't help that they sometimes tended to cheat a bit when it comes to things like wonders. When you think back all the way to Civilization's origins as a board game in the early 1980s, Civ II definitely has that feeling of a group of players sitting around a massive board. The tiniest of touches, such as the lists that often come up revealing the wealthiest, biggest or most advanced civilizations in the world, do help with that a bit, giving you just enough insight into how others are doing and where you are in the pecking order. The same applies to new additions like the reputation system, and the inclusion of a lot more advice on what you should possibly do next. As in the original, you'll get recommendations on what technology you should research next, or what you should build from both a military and domestic perspective. But there's plenty more interaction with the game this time around. It's very welcome, and immerses you further into this grand game while also helping you become better at it. Which of course leads us straight into the game's greatest and most important addition. Something that not only cemented Civ II as a great game, but one that would keep it wholly relevant and active for many years to come. I am of course talking about the High Council. What a glorious thing! Whenever you like, you can call them up and watch grainy videos where actors dressed in costumes tell you what to do. The bold military advisor waves his knife around as he demands more soldiers. The nerdy science advisor thinks it's all going okay, but perhaps the science rate should be raised just a little. You've mostly taken the military advisor's side, the river's one red with blood, and the yuppie trade advisor is horrified that you haven't even frickin' discovered trade yet. Our vaguely Eastern European foreign advisor thinks everything's going great, and is waiting for you to give orders to our spies so that they can start installing some atomic improvements in our enemies' cities, and if you play the game at all like I do, the attitude advisor who's dressed as Elvis is perpetually glum because the luxuries rate is firmly rooted at 0%. Who needs happiness when you've got technology and money? Ah, what a glorious thing. Okay, perhaps it's not the greatest and most important addition to Civilization II. It's a silly little bit of multimedia fun, along with the various wonder videos that you get whenever you successfully build a big project, and the throne room. It's very much of the era when no PC game or educational software could be shipped without a cache of low-quality .mov files, but it continues to be quite the laugh. It's especially great when you go and consult them during the period of anarchy you get when you change a government, and are immediately greeted with a cacophony of howls of outrage and wails into the ether. Lovely stuff.
Who knew this was going to happen? I knew this was going to happen. There will be no more gods. Women will.
So, what is Civilization II's most important improvement over the original? For real this time. It's right there in plain sight actually. The little menu option between World and Civilopedia marked Cheat. Yes, you can, if you wish, cheat to your heart's content. Once you enable cheat mode, you can do anything. Spawn all the units, research all the tech, build cities at the click of a button, even change the terrain of the world completely using the map editor. On the entirely superficial side of things, this allows you to let off steam and have some silly fun with your game. Sometimes it's just a laugh to spawn a few helicopters before you've even done so much as discovered alphabet. Has the ruler of a local civ turned down your offer of a few nuggets of gold in exchange for his knowledge of code of laws? Make him pay by sticking a few cruise missiles next to his huts. That'll learn him. Sure is easy to win when God's on your side, isn't it? So yes, you can use the cheat menu, quite simply, to cheat. However, the cheat menu has a far greater purpose. It's there so that you can modify your game of Civ II to your will. It's a full-on editor that allows you to basically change everything. To build a new map, to stick terrain and art in that you've created, to construct entirely new civilizations with their own characteristics, to conjure up brand new technologies, units and city improvements. To build scenarios. This, folks, is the big addition to Civilization II, the one that's going to cement its place in the PC world for the rest of time. Of all the additions to Civilization II, this godlike power was the one that Sid Meier had the most misgivings about. He was a little concerned about giving so much power to the player over the game to allow them this ability to basically do as they wish to it. But he'd come around on it soon enough. And, well, why not? In a way, this is how Brian Reynolds got started. He took the original Civilization and heavily modified it, creating Colonization in the process. And now, Brian Reynolds is making it easy for you to do it. The original game comes with a couple of sample scenarios as standard, one based on World War II and another concentrating on the rise of Rome, but the rest, well, it's up to you and your imagination. Needless to say, people responded to it immediately. They created scenarios and distributed them amongst each other all over the internet. They still do to this day, in fact. Just search Civ II scenarios and you'll find so many examples, some that are based on 20th century wars and various other historic battles, some that are deep dives into the what-ifs of alternate history, some that are complete flights of futuristic fantasy where you might well forget that you're actually playing Civilization II. When people talk about how great Civ II is, the scenarios should pretty much be the first thing on the list. The game was so bold as to stick the ability to modify it right there at the front, available with a single click. A true sandbox, and one whose influence is, quite frankly, incalculable as a result. Civilization II hands heavy over just about every other grand strategy game released after it, not to mention many games in other genres. Right there at the boom of modding, up there with the FPS titles, the Dooms and all of that. People were certainly able to do this sort of thing before, perhaps, but the games were never quite so yielding and so willing to let you play around with its inner workings. With Civ II, modding a game is basically thrust open to anyone who's got an idea, with a dead simple system that takes nothing except actually playing the game to learn. It may not have even been the main reason why people adored the game at the time, perhaps, but now, 25 years later, there are still people creating for Civilization II, and there probably always will be. Despite all the great Civilization games that have come after, a whole lot of people still play this one, as evidenced by that anecdote at the very start. Still, we should look more at the immediate reaction to Civ II, how scenarios would become the key selling point of the game's expansions, and the circumstances behind Civilization's core team deciding that they'd had enough of MicroProse and that they were going to strike out on their own. So as you might have guessed, Civilization II was a pretty significant success. One of the best-selling games of 1996, it was pretty much never out of the charts that year, and in fact was still kicking around in the upper reaches in 1997 and 1998. Jeff Briggs estimated in 2001 that the game had sold around about 3 million, mostly on PC, although there had also been perfectly okay sales for the game's acceptable if somewhat hamstrung PlayStation port. The reviews, as you might expect, were outstanding across the board. It was immediately proclaimed one of the greatest PC games of all time. As far as honours from websites go, IGN did go as far as to rank it the third greatest game quite literally ever in 2007. And hey, whether it's IGN or not, that's pretty bloody decent going. And despite all of this, it would be the last game Brian Reynolds and Jeff Briggs made for MicroProse. Only a few months after the release of the game, the pair, and Sid Meier, announced that they were leaving the company and founding a new studio, Firaxis Games. What brought this on then? Well, the trio had found themselves increasingly unhappy with the management at MicroProse, particularly after the takeover by Spectrum Holobyte. It seems as though the work they were doing wasn't really taken particularly seriously. That despite the huge success of the first Civilization, the parent company didn't necessarily think that its success was going to be repeated. Now this had in a way been something of a blessing. It had meant that there wasn't an awful lot of managerial supervision on Civ II, the game was largely worked on without any interference, and the team were able to make a lot of rather significant changes that weren't particularly questioned. Still, it also felt somewhat galling, seeing as a situation had kind of developed in which the Civ team at MicroProse found themselves in direct competition with the management at MicroProse. Believe it or not, MicroProse, and by extension Spectrum Holobyte, were actually extremely confident that sales of CivNet, released in 1995, would far outstrip the sales of Civilization II. CivNet was something of a thorn in the side of the Civ II team, and of Sid Meier. It didn't have an awful lot to do with any of them, and wasn't exactly too much except Civilization, but with the addition of online multiplayer. In fact, Reynolds and company had hoped to add online multiplayer to Civilization 2. They couldn't, and part of the reason for that was down to CivNet. And CivNet? Well, it got lukewarm reviews and kind of sank to obscurity pretty quickly. Aside from the online multiplayer and the addition of a world editor, it was basically just a pure re-release of Civilization, and fans rejected it in favour of Civ II, which was released only a few months later. Even if Civ II didn't have any online multiplayer, its release immediately consigned CivNet to the bargain bin, and just like the original game, even if it never actually topped the monthly sales charts, its sales would just run and run and run, an evergreen title that sold very well month after month for a good few years. And so the ever-ailing MicroProse no longer has the Civ guys on their books, meaning that they no longer have the guy who was pretty much their leading brand now either. They've all buggered off to form Firaxis and largely work with EA. They do still have Civilization on the books, mind you, and the game will enjoy a couple of expansions. The best of these naturally are the ones which concentrate on scenarios. Conflicts in Civilization and Fantastic Worlds bring some of the best scenarios available together on CD-ROM, with all the different takes you might expect. For many, the most memorable of these is the scenario in Fantastic Worlds that's basically Civilization 2 meets XCOM, although others are based on both Master of Magic and Master of Orion. Then of course there are the other Meteor expansions and re-releases. The Multiplayer Gold Edition does, as you might expect, add network multiplayer and hotshot features, very welcome of course. However, it also tweaks the AI and makes it far more aggressive, which does kind of spoil a lot of the careful diplomacy. And then there's Test of Time, which is, well, it's almost a complete overhaul. New interface, new animations. Geez, you could almost think that it was a new bloody game. It's not so much a large expansion as it is a damn near total remake, and therefore it requires a bit more explanation and context. That being a look at the messy fight between games companies, which saw several different studios putting out games called Civilization in the late 90s. Without getting too deep into the legalese, It appears as though Avalon Hill really wanted some proper meaty pounds of flesh over the whole Civilization issue, the one that had angered them greatly in the first place when the original Civ came out, and they found that it was in many ways quite similar to the tabletop game they published. In 1997, with the company struggling financially, they decided to get into bed with Bobby Kotick's Activision, selling them the rights to the Civilization name. A few months later, Activision and Avalon Hill sued MicroProse with the aim of getting Civ II off the shelves. Avalon Hill claimed that their initial agreements with MicroProse only extended to the first game and no others. In response, MicroProse bought Heartland Trefoil, the small British board game company owned by Francis Tresham, the original creator and seller of Civilization, before the game had been brought to America by Avalon Hill. Doing this, MicroProse believed, gave them exclusive rights to Civilization in both computer game and board game form, and they immediately countersued. The main reason why Activision and Avalon Hill worked together on this, presumably, was to sweep the board clean and make a path for Activision's Civ game, Civilization Call to Power, which was eventually released in April of 1999. The legal dispute was quite clearly one that was going to take years upon years to be hammered out, and so the two sides reached an out-of-court settlement in early '99. By this stage, the wheels had been set in motion for Hasbro to buy up both Avalon Hill and MicroProse, so it didn't matter an awful lot anymore. Still, MicroProse released Civilization II Test of Time in July of 1999 as something of a response. Most of the changes are purely cosmetic in nature, and reviews were a little middling, although it does have something of a legacy in that it is what the later Free Civ was based on. And let's not forget that through all of this, you had Firaxis' Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri. Alpha Centauri was released in February 1999 with Brian Reynolds at the helm, is essentially the real continuation of the Civilization line in the eyes of most people. Neither Call to Power or Test of Time can hold a candle to it, and chances are we'll probably be doing an entire video about it at some point because it's one of the best games ever made. Still, there are some odd quirks, particularly about Call to Power, that might have had a bit of influence on the lineage, even if back then when more people saw it as part of the main series, despite not having anything to do with any Civ creator and indeed being made by a different company, it was seen as a bit of a disappointment. And yes, the whole thing can be rather confusing. Amusingly enough, thinking back to the troubles that surrounded Colonization, it's the first Civ game to include slavery, in the form of slaver units that can take the populations away from your city, as well as their natural enemy, liberators. It's also the first Civ game to really start playing with religion, again in the form of the cleric or televangelist unit, which can be used in a similar vein to a diplomat or spy, corrupting an enemy's city but in a different way. Religion's not going to be a major facet of any Civ game until much later, so even if Call to Power 1 and 2, the second one didn't have the Civilization name on it at all, were perhaps playing with these things in slightly crude ways, it was a bit ahead of the curve in this regard. The games do still have small yet dedicated pockets of fans in the Civilization community to this day, and they are just about accepted as official Civ games of a sort. For all that they could easily be bloody terrible, miserable, blatant copies, they're not actually all that bad. And, well, I think it's a good idea to draw a line here. With the sale of MicroProse to Hasbro in April 1999, and then later the sale of Hasbro Interactive to Infogrames in the early 2000s, the Civilization brand eventually ends up back under the guard of Firaxis when Infogrames decides to work with them and produce Civilization 3. Naturally, Firaxis are still in charge of the game now, even though Infogrames eventually sold the Civ brand to 2K Games in the mid-noughties. There's a possibility that we might look at all of this in another video somewhere further down the line, but whenever there is a next video about Civilization, well, as I said already, I think you know what game that's going to cover, and it sure as hell isn't Civilization 3. That's not the next video or anything, but, well, someday. But all that's left is to ask you to bring me more soldiers so that I may bathe in the beating hearts of my enemies, and to wish you all a thoroughly pleasant bye for now.